by expressing my disappointment at the vote that took place in the House today regarding the defense budget. It seems to me that at a time when Speaker Gingrich and his colleagues are talking about the need to move this country toward a balanced budget and are talking about the crisis of our deficit situation, that it makes no sense for the Republican leadership to be proposing a defense budget which is $13 billion more than President Clinton has requested. And I find it especially hypocritical that at a time when the Republican leadership is saying that we have got to balance the budget, and to do so we must make major cuts in Medicare, major cuts in Medicaid, major cuts in education, in veterans programs, in environmental protection, in the fuel assistance program, and so many programs that the middle class and the working class of this country depend upon, low-income people depend upon, that at the same time, Mr. Gingrich says, well, it's okay that we spend billions more for B-2 bombers that the Pentagon doesn't want, that we start spending billions of dollars more for the Star Wars program. The budget of the United States government is what this country is all about, and I think it's a sad day that we are saying that it is appropriate to spend billions more on the military despite the end of the Cold War, that we are prepared to put approximately $100 billion into defending Europe and Asia, although we don't even know who the enemy is there, but we don't have enough money to take care of our senior citizens who are in need. We don't have enough money to take care of our children. This country has by far the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. 22% of our kids are in poverty. We don't have enough money to help them. We do have enough money to build B-2 bombers and Star Wars and things that the Pentagon doesn't even want. I think that is a very sad state of priorities that Mr. Gingrich and the Republican leadership are expressing. Mr. Speaker, what I want to concentrate on today is what I think is the most important issue facing this country, and that is the state of our economy and my very great fears that this country in many ways is moving toward an oligarchy, which is a nation controlled by relatively small numbers of very, very wealthy people. What is going on in this country today is that since 1973, 80% of all American families have seen their incomes either decline or at best remain stagnant. What is going on in my state of Vermont and what is going on all over this country today is that we are seeing working people work longer hours for lower wages, and these families look to the future and they're extremely worried about what's going to happen to their kids, because it appears very likely that for the first time in the modern history of the United States, our children will have a lower standard of living than we will have. This, in my view, is the most important issue facing this country, and I get very disappointed as an independent, as the only independent in the Congress, that we don't see enough discussion here on that issue, certainly from the Republican leadership, and we must have more of that discussion. What is also going on in this country is not only is the middle class shrinking, but we are seeing another phenomenon that should be of concern to all people, and that is that the wealthiest people in this country are becoming much wealthier at the same time as the middle class is shrinking. We're looking at a schizophrenic economy. How bad is the situation today facing the working men and women of this country? Let me just make a few points. And again, these are points I think that should be made over and over again. 20 years ago, the workers of the United States were the best compensated in the entire world. We were number one. Today, depending upon the study that you might look at, American workers rank 13th among industrialized nations in terms of compensation and benefits. In fact, one of the great ironies of the current economic period is that we're seeing companies from Europe and elsewhere come to the United States in search of quote-unquote cheap labor. In my state of Vermont and throughout this country, you can get hard-working individuals who must work for $6 an hour or $7 an hour, and those are wages that large companies can't get workers to work for in Europe. So we are seeing for certain European companies the United States becoming what Mexico is for American companies. That is a very sad state of affairs. Adjusted for inflation, the average pay for 4/5 of American workers plummeted by 16% in the 20 years between 1973 and 1993. In other words, whenever you turn on the television or whenever you read the newspapers and they talk about the booming economy, the economy is booming for someone, but it certainly is not booming for the middle class or the working people of this country. Between 1973 and 1993, the average pay for 4/5 of American workers plummeted by 16%. People are working for significantly lower wages. In 1973, the average American worker earned $445 a week. 20 years later, that worker was making $373 a week. And that is the issue that should be debated here on the floor of the House, should be debated in the Senate every single day, should be debated all over this country. How do we go from 1st to 13th in the world in terms of the wages and benefits our workers received? How did it happen that the middle class is shrinking? How did it happen that real wages are declining? That is the $64 issue that should be addressed by the President, by the leadership of the Republican and Democratic parties. And Mr. Speaker, as bad as the situation is for the middle class and middle class workers, the situation is far worse for young American workers. In the last 15 years, the wages for entry-level jobs for young men who are high school graduates has declined by 30%. 30%. Young families headed by persons younger than 30 saw their inflation-adjusted median income collapse by 32% from 1973 to 1990. Young families headed by someone between 25 and 24, these are young American families, had incomes $4,000 lower in 1991 than they did in 1979. Their entry-level wages were 10% lower in 1991 than in 1979. Now, what all those statistics mean is that for young people graduating high school, going out into the job market, the wages that they are earning are significantly lower than was the case just 20 years ago. So as bad as the situation is for middle-aged people, it is a lot worse for younger people, and that's an issue that we must address and analyze and correct. Americans at the lower end of the wage scale are now the lowest paid workers in the entire industrialized world. 18% of American workers with full-time jobs are paid so little that their wages do not enable them to live above the poverty level. You know, we hear a whole lot. We heard it from President Reagan. We heard it from President Bush. We are hearing it from President Clinton about all of the new jobs that are being created. The sad truth, however, is that the vast majority of the jobs being created are low-wage jobs. These are the jobs that pay workers $6 an hour. They pay workers $7 an hour. They often bring no health care benefits, no retirement benefits, and no time off for vacations or sick leave. Also, one of the frightening aspects of the new economy is that more and more of the new jobs being created are part-time jobs or temporary jobs. What we are seeing is that many employers would rather hire two people for 20 hours a week or for 30 hours a week rather than one worker for 40 hours a week because the employer does not have to pay any benefits. In fact, in 1993, 1/3 of the United States workforce was comprised of quote-unquote contingent labor, and that is temporary labor. That means that you get a job for 4 months, for 6 months, and then you got to go out looking for another job again. There was a time not so long ago in our history when a real job meant 40 hours a week with benefits, a decent health care, perhaps retirement, that you moved up the ladder. If you did your job well, you made more money, you had a certain sense of job security. It seems that those days are ancient history, as many of the new jobs that are being created are part-time jobs or temporary jobs. In the past 10 years, the United States has lost 3 million white-collar jobs and 1.8 million jobs in manufacturing just in the past 5 years. 5 companies, Ford, AT&T, General Electric, IT&T, and Union Carbide alone have laid off well over 800,000 American workers in the last 15 years. Meanwhile, while the decent paying jobs continue to disappear, the number of involuntary part-time workers tripled between 1970 and 1993. And people might be surprised to know that the largest private sector employer in the United States today is not General Motors, it's not General Electric, it's not IBM, it is Manpower Incorporated, and they are the leading supplier of temporary employees. Now, one of the tragic results of declining wages in America is that the average American worker is now working significantly more hours than used to be the case. The number of Americans working at more than one job has almost doubled over the last 15 years. So if the average American thinks, my God, I'm the only person who has to work 2 jobs or 3 jobs, wake up, it's your neighbor doing that. It is people all over this country, because as real wages decline, people are just scrambling as hard as they can, and certainly in the state of Vermont, it is not unusual to see people working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, just to pay the bills. And furthermore, when we talk about things like family values, I think what many of us mean is the ability of a husband and a wife to spend some quality time with their kids. And I remember seeing a constituent of mine in Burlington, Vermont, who told me as she was shopping at a grocery store that she was working 3 part-time jobs and her husband was working 4 part-time jobs. They hardly ever had a chance to be together or let alone to spend time with their child. And that is what is happening all over this country. Not only are people working longer hours, and in fact the average American is now working approximately 160 hours a year more than was the case just 20 years ago, but what we are also seeing is that more and more Americans are lacking adequate medical insurance. We had a major debate here on the floor of the House several years ago about the need for a national health care policy. Those of us who advocated the right of all Americans to have health care as exists in virtually every other industrialized nation on earth, we lost that debate. And the result is that 3 years later, we're seeing more and more Americans not only without any health insurance, but we're seeing more Americans who have inadequate health insurance. And by that I mean very high premiums, large deductibles, large co-payments. And the situation is such that many people, just even when they're sick, hesitate to go to the doctor because they just can't afford the bill. In terms of home ownership, which is a key part of the American dream, that home ownership is also in rapid decline for the average American worker. As a result of lower and lower incomes, an increasing number of young Americans can no longer afford to purchase their own homes. In 1980, 21% of Americans under 25 owned their own homes. In 1987, only 16% did. And the answer is obvious. If you're not making decent wages, there's no way you're going to be able to put a down payment or pay the mortgage on a home. Mr. Speaker, while the middle class is in decline, while the real wages of American workers are going down, while many of the new jobs are being created, pay people $4.50 or $5 and $6 an hour, there is another aspect of our economy that must be addressed. And that is, clearly not everybody is hurting. Some people are doing very, very well. And this is an issue we just don't talk about enough, I think, on this floor of the House. And certainly the media does not talk about it enough. Today, the United States has the dubious distinction of having the most unfair distribution of wealth and income in the entire industrialized world. I think many of us used to think that in countries like England, where you have queens and dukes and lords and barons, that those were really class countries, that you had a ruling class and an upper class and you had a lower class. But the truth of the matter is that the United States of America today has a much more unfair and unequal distribution of wealth than England, and we have a much more unequal distribution of wealth than any other country on earth. Hardly ever talk about this issue, but we should. What is going on now is that the wealthiest 1% of the population own 40% of the wealth in this nation, and that is more wealth than the bottom 90%. The richest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 90%, and that gap between the rich and the poor is growing wider. But it's not only wealth. We also have the most unfair distribution of income in the entire industrialized world. The highest earning 4% of our population make more money than do the bottom 51%. Mr. Speaker, from 1979 to 1995, household incomes in the United States grew by $800 billion in real terms. But 50% of that sum went to the wealthiest 5% of households, and 97% of it went to the wealthiest 20%. The remaining 80% of families scrambled for the crumbs, divvying up just 3% of all income growth between them. So in other words, when we talk about the growth of the economy, what we should ask ourselves is who is gaining that income. And what is clearly going on is the lion's share, the overwhelming amount of the growth in income is going to the very, very wealthiest people, while the vast majority of the people are seeing a decline in their real incomes. Mr. Speaker, there are a number of reasons why the United States is seeing a decline in its standard of living for its middle class and for its working people. And I think one of them certainly has to do with the decline in our industrial base, in the decline of manufacturing in the United States of America. I would urge members of Congress just to go to their local department stores in virtually any part of America and check the labels on the products that they are observing. And more, what we are finding is that products are not manufactured in the United States, but they are manufactured in the Far East, they're manufactured in Malaysia, more and more they are manufactured in China. And we're not just talking about cheap products, but we're talking about top-of-the-line products as well. And the reason that more and more products are being manufactured in China is that American companies are beginning, or have invested tens and tens of billions of dollars in China, in Malaysia, in Latin America, and many other very poor third world countries. So the good news is that corporate America is creating millions of new jobs every single year. The bad news is that they are not creating those jobs in the state of Vermont or in the United States of America. They are creating those jobs in China and in Malaysia and in Latin America. Now, why are these companies running to those countries? Well, it doesn't take a PhD in economics to figure it out. They are going to China because workers in China receive 20 cents an hour. There are workers in China who are 12 or 13 years of age making products that we in the United States are purchasing. And Mr. Speaker, I might mention that I have introduced legislation which would prohibit the importation of products made in any country that is made by child labor. There are children in China, children in India, children in Pakistan who are 10, 11, 12 years old, who are working for minuscule wages, who are doing the work that American workers used to do. It is no secret that this year we will have a trade deficit of about $160 billion. That means we're importing $160 billion more in goods and services than we export. That equates to about 3 million decent manufacturing jobs. Mr. Speaker, in my view, we are not going to expand the middle class. We're not going to create decent paying jobs for our young people unless we deal with the trade situation. I think the evidence is very clear that NAFTA has been a disaster, as many of us had feared it would be. I have very serious reservations about GATT. We need a trade policy that is a fair trade policy, a trade policy that protects American workers, that allows us to export as well as import. Mr. Speaker, if we are going to address the issue of raising wages in America, not only do we have to deal with the trade situation, not only do we have to become a country, again, which is building real products here in the United States of America, which is using our technology to create new jobs, producing real goods, but we also have to, in fact, raise the minimum wage. And I am delighted that more and more members of Congress are beginning to understand that. A number of years ago, I brought forth legislation that would raise the minimum wage to $5.50 an hour. It was my view and is my view that if somebody in this country works for 40 hours a week, that person should not be living in poverty. That person should not be more in debt at the end of the week than he or she was at the beginning of the week. And when some of us began that crusade to raise the minimum wage, President Clinton was not on board, many Democrats were not on board, and virtually no Republicans were on board. I am happy to say that right now we have a majority support for raising the minimum wage in the House. I believe that's the case in the Senate as well. And I certainly hope that Mr. Gingrich will allow a clean minimum wage bill to come up in the House so that we can vote it in and have the President sign it. The minimum wage today is at its lowest point in 40 years. If the minimum wage today was at the same level as it was in 1970, it would be over $6 an hour. So to raise the minimum wage to $5.15 an hour, as the President would have us do in 2 years, is a conservative effort, and it's something that we should do immediately. Mr. Speaker, if we're going to turn this country around, I think it's important that we also address the tax situation in this country. The fact of the matter is that as the rich become richer, and as the middle class is shrinking, and as poor people are just fighting desperately to keep their heads above water, I think what we need to do is take a hard look at progressive taxation. And that is to say to the largest corporations who are today contributing significantly less to our national coffers than they did 30 or 40 years ago, to the richest people in this country who have enjoyed significant declines in their real tax rates, that it is appropriate to ask those people whose incomes are soaring to start paying their fair share of taxes so we can provide some real tax breaks for the middle class and the working people of this country. Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons that wages in America have declined is that the trade union movement in America has also declined. I think it will not be a surprise to most American workers to understand that employers often do not, out of the generosity of their heart, pay decent wages. They pay decent wages because there are people who are negotiating with them to get them to pay decent wages. One of the concerns that I have right now in this country is that it is harder and harder for workers to be able to form trade unions. Very often employers will harass those workers who are trying to develop a union. They will fire those workers under all kinds of pretenses. They will bring in highfalutin consultants to try to frighten workers. They will threaten workers that they're going to go to Mexico and Asia. I think we need a new set of labor law which says that any worker in this country who wants to join a union should have the freedom, without fear, to participate in that process. And I believe that as we strengthen the labor movement in this country, that as more and more workers join unions, they will be stronger and being able to negotiate good contracts which will not only benefit them, but it will benefit the whole country. Non-union workers benefit substantially when we have strong unions because unions drive wages up, and employers therefore must pay non-union workers a decent wage as well. Mr. Speaker, I will soon be introducing a piece of legislation which I think is quite important. One of the concerns that I have increasingly in this country is the degree to which the taxpayers of our nation are subsidizing large corporations through corporate welfare. Very conservative groups as well as progressive groups estimate that we spend about $125 billion every year on corporate welfare, which is tax breaks and subsidies that go to some of the largest corporations in America. And let me give you just one example of something that I and some of my colleagues are working on right now. It seems to me to be very wrong that when the United States Pentagon, when our Pentagon negotiates with various defense contractors, that some of the CEOs of those defense companies end up making huge salaries, basically at taxpayer expense, at the same time as they are laying off tens and tens of thousands of American workers. We pay the President of the United States $250,000 a year, and it seems to me to be very wrong that the taxpayers of this country should be paying the CEOs of the major defense companies substantially more. I think the taxpayers of America should be concerned, for example, that in 1994, James Mellor, who was the CEO of General Dynamics, earned $11.3 million in compensation. Now, what's interesting is that General Dynamics, as a percentage of their business, does 100% of their business with the United States government, which means that the United States government is paying Mr. Mellor $11.3 million in income. And I think that that's wrong for at least two reasons. Number one, in terms of our deficit, I don't know why we're paying CEOs who are 100% dependent on taxpayer money over $11 million a year in compensation. That's wrong. But second of all, it is wrong as an example, as a model of what this Congress should be doing. One of the more shameful aspects of the American economy at this point is that CEOs of major corporations today are earning about 200 times what their workers are making, 200 times. That's unheard of in the industrialized world. It seems to me that the United States Congress should not be encouraging and supporting that type of economic activity. So we have legislation, and I've introduced legislation along with several other members, that would say to the CEOs of the major defense companies that they cannot earn from the taxpayers of this country more than $200,000 a year in compensation. I should point out once more that the head of General Dynamics receives $11.3 million, and as best as we can understand, every single penny of that money comes from the taxpayers of this country. That does not make any sense. We're cutting back on so many programs that working people need, and to say, yeah, we got $11 million to pay the head of General Dynamics makes no sense. And I should point out that this very same company has laid off over 35,000 workers between 1990 and 1995. So these guys are making more and more money from the taxpayers at exactly the same time as they are laying off tens of thousands of American workers. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. Mr. Speaker, I think, sometimes members of the Congress become a little bit obsessed with ourselves, and we think that the end of the world is the Beltline around here. But we should pay attention to the fact that tens of millions of people are giving up on the political process. They're giving up on the two-party system. Again, it's an issue that we don't talk about too much, but maybe as the only independent in the Congress, I can raise the issue. And that is, there is something fundamentally wrong with the politics of this country when in the last election in 1994, only 38% of the people came out to vote. 62% of the people did not vote. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But I think the major reason has to do with the fact that large numbers of people who are hurting very, very badly no longer believe that the United States Congress represents their interests, is capable of responding to their needs and their pain. And they're saying, hey, politics, it doesn't matter. We don't care what's going on in Washington. We don't pay attention to what's going on in Washington because all these people are living in another world. I think given the fact that so many men and women have put their lives on the line, who have fought and died to defend freedom and democracy in this country, it is a very sad state of affairs that the United States today has by far the lowest voter turnout of any industrialized nation on earth. Now, how do we turn that around? How do we create a vibrant democracy where we have 70, 80% of the people voting rather than 40% of the people or 50% of the people? And I think, frankly, the answer is that this Congress has got to show the American people that we do feel their pain, that we do understand what's going on in their lives, and we are willing to respond to their problems. If we don't respond to their problems, people are going to say, it doesn't make any difference. Why do I have to get involved? But it's a catch-22. Unless ordinary people begin to stand up and say, wait a second, the United States Congress should be representing all of the people in this country and not just the very rich. In the United States of America, we should be able to provide health insurance for every man, woman, and child, as most of the industrialized nations do. In the United States of America, we should be able to make sure that every young person who has the ability is able to get a college education, as many of our industrialized neighbors do. That in the United States of America, we should be able to create decent paying jobs. That unless the people make those demands on the Congress and start electing people to the Congress who are going to fight for the middle class, fight for the working people, the Congress is going to be unresponsive. And that takes us to another issue in terms of how and why the Congress is unresponsive, and that takes us to campaign finance reform. Clearly, there is something very much amiss when increasingly we are seeing in Congress, in state houses all over America, very wealthy people taking out their checkbooks and writing themselves large checks and saying, gee, I think I'd like to run for president. You know, it's kind of boring in business now. I've got a midlife crisis. I'd like to do something else. I'll make out a check and run for the presidency. I'll run for governor. I'll run for Senate and so forth and so on. That's not what democracy is supposed to be about. Democracy is not supposed to be about the Democratic and Republican parties holding fundraisers here in Washington, D.C., where I think last month or a couple of months ago, the Republicans raised $16 million in one night, and recently the Democrats raised $12 million in one night, money which is coming from some of the wealthiest people in the United States of America, some of the largest corporations in the United States of America. Some of these guys contribute to both political parties. Is that what democracy is supposed to be about? I think not. I think we must move toward campaign finance reform, and the most important aspects of that is we've got to limit the amount of money that people can spend in a campaign. If you limit the amount of money, you take away the advantage of the big money interests. They can't outspend you 10 to 1. I think we've got to move toward public funding of elections combined with incentives coming from small donations, matching small donations. In that way, we will have people who are serving in Congress who come from the ranks of ordinary people and simply are not hobnobbing with the wealthy and the powerful. But most importantly, what concerns me is that tens and tens of millions of Americans believe the political process does not matter to them. They have given up on that political process, and that is very, very sad. And I would suggest to people, and I say this as somebody who was a mayor of a city for 8 years and now in my third term in the United States Congress, that the only solution, basically, to that situation is for ordinary people to begin to stand up and fight back and reclaim this country for the ordinary people, for the middle class, for the working people of this country, and inform the United States Congress that all of us have a right to a decent standard of living and a good life. All of our children have the right to a good future, and that right should not just exist to the very wealthy and the very powerful. But that's not going to change unless people get involved in the political process, unless people understand what's going on at all levels of government. Mr. Speaker, let me just simply conclude by stating that in this great country, if democracy is to survive, if all of our people are to enjoy a decent standard of living, that's not a utopian vision. That can happen. But people have got to be involved in the political process, and they've got to stand up and fight for their rights. Mr. Speaker, I would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the following members be permitted to extend their remarks and to include extraneous material in that section of the record entitled Extensions of Remarks. Mr. Dornan, Mr. Zeliff, Mr. Friesa, Ms. Eshoo, Mr. Farr of California, Mr. Barton of Texas, Ms. First, Mr. Cardin, Ms. Collins of Illinois, Mr. Coyne, Mr. Ward.
Without objection.